160 kilometers. That is the length of the river one man decided to clean by hand, with no money, no machinery, no government behind him, and at the start, no one beside him at all. The river was called the Kali Bain, a slow, sacred ribbon of water threading through the Punjab in northern India, and by the summer of 2000 it was no longer really a river. It was an open drain. The sewage of 6 towns and 40 villages poured into it. A thick green skin of floating weed had sealed over its surface so completely that in places you could not tell there was water underneath at all. Parts of it had simply stopped flowing and dried into cracked mud. And into that ruined, stinking, holy channel, in July of that year, a Sikh holy man named Balbir Singh Sitwal waded in and began, more or less alone, to pull it out by the armful. The people who knew the river expected him to fail, because everyone before him had. What none of them expected, least of all the man himself, was that cleaning this one river would do something to the land for kilometers in every direction that no irrigation scheme, no government program, and no amount of money had ever managed to do. I'm Harold Calder, and this is the story of how a holy man with no engineering degree and no budget revived a dead river, and in doing so accidentally refilled the groundwater beneath an entire region, brought wells back from 40 years of silence, and handed the rest of India a blueprint it is still copying today. But before you can understand what he brought back, you have to understand what the Kali Bain actually is, because it is not just water. To the Sikh faith, this rivulet is close to holy ground. It runs past Sultanpur Lodi, the town where Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism, is said to have lived for years, and where, by tradition, he stepped into the waters of the Bain, vanished beneath them for 3 days, and emerged transformed, carrying the revelation that would become the foundation of the religion, a teaching that the divisions of caste and creed people fought and bled over dissolved before a single shared humanity and a single divine light. From that day forward, the Bain was a pilgrim's river. For generations, people came to its banks to bathe and to pray, to stand for a moment where the founder of their faith was said to have stood. A river is seldom only a river anywhere, but this one carried 5 centuries of memory in its slow current. For 5 centuries then, this was not a drain. It was a place people came to bathe, to pray, to remember. And it was also, in the plainest, practical terms, the lifeline of the Doaba, the fertile slice of Punjab cradled between rivers, where the Bain fed the fields and the water table the fields drank from. So when this river died, it was not only a sacred thing that was lost, it was the water itself. Now, how does a holy river become an open sewer? The answer is the same quiet machinery that has poisoned waterways all over the modern world. Punjab was the engine of India's green revolution, the great surge in farm output that fed a nation, and that surge ran on water and chemicals, pumped and poured into the land faster than the land could absorb. Punjab fed a nation, and the hidden price it paid was its own water, drawn down from underground year after year faster than any monsoon could put it back, while the rivers that still ran on the surface ran more fouled with every passing season. The towns grew, the factories came, and the easiest place to send the waste, the household sewage and the industrial effluent both, was the nearest channel, which was the Bain. Year after year it took more than it could carry. The flow slowed, then slackened, then in places stopped. And once the water goes still, an opportunist takes over, a floating plant called water hyacinth, a fast-spreading weed that mats across the surface of stagnant water in a dense green carpet, choking off the light and the oxygen below until everything beneath it suffocates. The Bain disappeared under that carpet. The name Kali Bain means, roughly, the Black Stream, and by the end of the century, it had earned the name in the worst possible way. People had appealed to the municipal bodies, to the government for years. Nothing came. Meanwhile, the cost of the dead river was paid quietly and locally. Wells failed. Crops thinned. The water that should have been a blessing had turned into a hazard, and a place that had drawn pilgrims for half a millennium now drove people back with its stench. This is the slow, undramatic way a living thing is lost, not in one great catastrophe, but in 1,000 small surrenders, until one day everyone agrees, without ever quite deciding it, that this is simply how the river is now and how it will always be. And that is the moment Balbir Singh Sitwal stepped into the story. He was a Nirmala Sikh, a holy man from the village that gave him the name he is known by, and when he learned that this particular river was the one Guru Nanak had bathed in, he made a decision that sounded, at the time, faintly absurd. He would clean it, all 160 kilometers of it, himself if he had to. Officials who had spent whole careers around that river regarded the idea as, charitably, the dream of a man who did not grasp the scale of what he was looking at. And here is the part that turns a single stubborn man into a movement, because he did not have a budget and he did not ask for one. He reached instead for something far older than any government program, a tradition his faith already carried, called Kar Sewa. Kar Sewa is the Sikh practice of selfless physical service, the idea that the highest form of worship is to do the humble work with your own hands for the good of all, expecting nothing in return. And Sitwal turned that idea loose on a river. He began teaching the people of the villages along the Bain what the river was, what it had been, and what it could be again. One man became a handful. A handful became a crowd. Volunteers came from more than 24 villages and then from dozens more, until at the peak there were thousands of ordinary people, farmers and shopkeepers and grandmothers, standing in the muck of a dead river and hauling it back to life by hand. It was filthy, unglamorous, repetitive work, the kind no machine was coming to do and no salary was paying for, and they came back to it day after day, season after season. They paid for the equipment themselves, village by village, rupee by rupee. They tore out the hyacinth in great dripping rafts. They dredged out decades of black silt. They rebuilt the banks the river had lost, laid brick paths along it, raised bathing steps, and planted orchards of fruit and medicine down its length. There was no contractor, no central plan, no minister cutting a ribbon. There was a holy man, a borrowed tradition, and a few thousand pairs of hands, and across roughly 2 years the impossible quietly became ordinary. The Kali Bain began to flow again, and then came the part nobody had planned for, the part that still gives this story its strange power. Because Sitwal had set out to restore a sacred river for the sake of the sacred. What he got was something the engineers would have told you needed pipelines and pumping stations and a budget the size of a small nation. When the channel opened and the water moved and soaked back into the ground the way it used to, the water table beneath the whole region began to rise. Hand pumps that had stood dry for 40 years, wells that 2 generations of farmers had given up on, started yielding water again. Land that had been waterlogged and useless drained and came back into cultivation. Land that had been sliding toward desert was watered, and down where the Bain meets the great confluence of the Bees and the Sutlej, ground that had flooded was steadied. 3 different curses on 3 different stretches of land, waterlogging in one district, creeping desert in another, flooding down at the confluence, all of them easing at roughly the same time because the river at the center of them was breathing again. Farmers who had been ruined came back to fields they had written off. Families returned to the banks for festivals and afternoons in the sun. The devout waded once more into water clean enough to pray in. One river, cleaned by hand, and a whole region's broken water balance began, on its own, to mend. He had unblocked the artery, and the body did the rest. And the mechanism behind it is not mystical at all, which is part of what makes it so quietly hopeful. A flowing, unclogged river is not just a channel that carries water past you. It is a long, slow leak into the ground beneath it, constantly seeping down through the riverbed to top up the hidden reservoir we call an aquifer, the layer of water-bearing rock and sand that wells and hand pumps draw from. Choke the river, and that recharge stops, and the aquifer below it falls year by year until the pumps suck nothing but air. clear the river, let it flow and seep again, and the recharge switches back on. Sitwal had not performed a miracle. He had reopened a tap that had been jammed shut for a generation. Now, I want to be careful here, because it is easy to let a story like this tip over into pure miracle. And the more interesting truth is that what happened next was studied, copied, and exported, which is the real test of whether something works. Out of the cleanup came what people now simply call the Sitwal model, a low-cost, community-run way of dealing with the sewage that had killed the river in the first place, channeling a village's wastewater into a series of ponds where it is settled and cleaned by natural processes and then used instead of dumped to irrigate the fields. It is cheap. It needs no vast central plant. And it has been taken up by well over 100 villages across Punjab, each one quietly keeping its own share of filth out of the surface water for good. The recognition followed the results. In 2008, Time magazine named Sitwal one of its heroes of the environment, the only person from India and from all of Asia on that list. India later gave him the Padma Shri, one of its highest civilian honours. The central government, facing the far larger agony of the Ganga, came to this village holy man to ask how he had done it. And that invitation cuts both ways, because it measures how far his idea travelled and, at the same time, where it runs out. A method built on a few thousand neighbours, clearing a 160-kilometre rivulet by hand, does not simply scale up to a river that drains a quarter of a country. Some of what he proved is universal, and some of it lived in the particular intimacy of people cleaning the water their own children would drink. He has been honoured in the parliaments of other countries. The man who started alone in the mud became, fairly, a global symbol of a single idea he keeps returning to, that rivers can be brought back if people will simply do the work together. But I promised you honesty, and an honest telling cannot end on the trophy shelf, because a river is never finished, and the Bain has not stopped testing that. In July of 2022, at the 22nd anniversary of the cleanup, the Chief Minister of Punjab walked down to the celebrated river, scooped up a cup of its water in front of a cheering crowd, and drank it, to prove how clean it had become. Within days, he was admitted to a hospital with a stomach ailment and flown to the capital for treatment. His party insisted it was a routine checkup and the timing a coincidence. His critics insisted it was nothing of the kind, and the plain fact underneath all the political noise is the uncomfortable one. A river can be famous, revived, celebrated, and still not be a thing you should drink straight from, because sewage and industrial waste keep pressing in from every town along its length, and the moment the hands stop working, the weed and the filth begin to creep back. Restoration, it turns out, is not a finish line you cross once. It is a verb. It has to be done, and then it has to be done again, forever. And that, in the end, is the lesson I keep coming back to with this one. We tend to believe that fixing a broken piece of the natural world is a job for budgets and ministries and engineers, for somebody official somewhere else, with the right equipment and the right authority. The Kali Bain says something quieter and more demanding than that. The river did not need a genius or a fortune. It needed its channel cleared, and it needed people willing to clear it and to keep clearing it. Sitwal did not invent the water that filled those dead wells. He did not engineer the recharge or design the recovery. He removed what was choking the river, and then he and a few thousand neighbours got out of its way, and the water remembered what it had always known how to do. So step back and look at the whole shape of it. 160 kilometres of holy water reduced to a black drain. A single man with no money and a borrowed tradition. Thousands of hands in the muck across 2 patient years. Dead wells refilling for the first time in 4 decades. A model now copied across a state and eyed for the greatest river in the land. And a quiet, unfinished, fragile victory that has to be defended every single year. If this changed the way you think about who is actually capable of healing a broken river, let me know in the comments, and tell me whether you believe this kind of restoration is better left to communities and volunteers or to governments and engineers. because I genuinely want to know where you land. If it moved you, share it with someone who needs to believe that one person can still start something this large. And subscribe, because there are more of these comeback stories than you would ever guess, and I have got plenty more to tell you. I'm Harold Calder. Thanks for watching.